Welcome to the Mission Advancement Podcast, where we talk about the importance of human connection, generosity, and leadership so that mission-minded leaders will be inspired and learn to grow. Today, we have a special guest, Nicole Gann. We'll introduce you here in a minute, and I'm thrilled my colleague Lacey Young, a longtime member of the Mission Advancement team, is also joining. Lacey has worked with Nicole and her organization for a long time, so it'd be fun to include her because of all the history and knowledge that you guys have gained working together. So,
Absolutely.
Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Yes.
It's so exciting to be here with both of you.
Thank you.
Love it.
So we're going to start with just you giving a little bit of introduction of yourself, the role you're in today, but a little bit of background of how you got there.
So I was born 77 years ago, which really, by today's kids' standards, I was born in the 1960s, kids listening, so it was a long time ago. But enough about me. What's the point of why we're here? I have the privilege of leading an organization called Juliette Fowler Communities, and I've been there for over 15 years, and Juliette Fowler Communities is an intergenerational living and program organization that has been in the business of serving at-risk youth and elders for a long time. I like to say we're probably the second oldest not-for-profit in Dallas that's still operational. And I think the beauty of kind of what led me there was relationships. That's how I've gotten every job I've ever gotten. I never aspired to be any of the things I became, but just showing up, walking through the door, saying yes, having a relationship led me to these things. I got into not-for-profit sector by accident, and I stayed by choice. And Juliette Fowler has been the best and brightest of all of those hallmarks, in my career because of not only what they do and who they serve, which I've shared, but it's also a representation of the power of just what one idea by one person can create, because our founder, Juliette, was that one person with that one idea born out of her own personal story. And look what's still happening today. I can't imagine she could have imagined, but here we are. I carry the weight of that with the team and our board and our donors and everyone who believes in us. But I carry that weight, just like everyone else, with honor. And so I've done a lot of things, in my career, but I feel like this is the one that allows me to integrate all of those things: my financial background, my operational background, my strategic background, my caring of people, my personal story. It's the one area that allows me to be fully who I am in all those capacities. So it's a little bit about me.
That's a great story.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, Lacey's going to drive, some of the conversation today again with her history, and I know one of our areas of focus is going to be on adapting to change. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you like to say you're the second largest. So I'm sure somebody's wondering, well, who's the second oldest? You said. Well, who's the first?
I feel like it's my friends Buckner.
Okay.
Buckner International.
Okay.
They
Right.
serve in the children's space and they serve in the elder space as well. Hi to all my friends at Buckner. But I think that's it. Okay. Listen, I'm making this up. Someone will have to fact check me. Okay.
Well, I do know that Juliette Peak Fowler had this vision on this plot of land in 1892.
That's right.
To serve widows and orphans. Now, that's a very different story in 1892 to where you are today, but even in the early 1900s, in the 20s, through the Great Depression, after World War I and II. And what does that look like over the history that you gained when you came into your role? And then I know what all has transpired in the last 8 years that we've been working together, but talk a little bit about that adaptation of change and how you as a leader took that on.
Okay, that's a great question. When I joined Fowler, I came as the CFO and came to work with the CEO who I'd worked with in another organization. And it really was about adapting and changing for the entire organization at the time because they were in a situation where they weren't sustainable. And a lot of the premise of when we came on was to basically do a turnaround, because you have this 100-plus year organization at the time that had served in a lot of different capacities, and it had already navigated many changes and many adaptations, from orphanages to transitional living, from caring only for widows to now caring for, all elders. So it wasn't like this organization hadn't seen change and hadn't adapted. But like many long-standing organizations, they had maybe leaned more into the mission side of it and not as much into the side of it that is a business and how do you create meaningful longevity, right? So I came into the role with eyes wide open. And I should also say I'm uniquely wired to handle change. And some might tell you that I thrive in it, because I always have believed that change is the one true constant. Right? And that's the thing you can count on. You can't predict a lot of other things, but you can predict changes, right? And in a way that brings me certainty and security. So I was coming on to help steward it in a financial capacity under the leadership of our CEO at that time, but it was all in an effort to continue serving the community that had been served for so long. And how are we going to do that in a meaningful way? I think this is important. I learned this early in my not-for-profit career, because I came from manufacturing, for-profit, worked for a lot of great organizations, right? There's a lot different focus. There's a focus on margin, there's a focus on ROI, there's a focus on product viability, and it's different in mission-based organizations, or it felt that way in the beginning. And I see a lot of mission-based organizations think that longevity is the only factor. But it's not just about longevity. It is about sustainability. And if we can't adapt and change, we cannot sustain. And if we can't sustain, all of our work eventually becomes a footnote in history, right? So not everybody wants to sign up for change. In fact, my experience is most people don't like it at all.
Yes.
If I can compel anyone to maybe re-examine that story and say why we should be excited about change, it's about sustainability. And if we like to use words like legacy and longevity, they need to be supported by the foundation of how are we going to sustain that in a way that's meaningful to our mission and meaningful to the people who come along with us in that mission, in our case, donors, board, leadership, and then the people who are served by that mission. And if we think about it in that framework, then I think change becomes more palpable, let's just say.
Yeah, I'm curious thinking, I know you guys relatively well, not as well as Lacey, and I hear the widow and orphans, like the origin story. Widows and orphans still exist today, obviously. So from just a mission perspective, what were the adaptations to mission in recent years that were required for you to thrive and sustain?
I think we had to take a real look at what we were doing. You cannot be all things to all people, right? And under the banner of children and elders, you can think of a lot of services that fall under that, and we've probably examined a lot of those. And we had to consider what we could maybe do really well and what we could not do well, and what we could do for a long period of time and what we couldn't. So, for example, we talked about orphanages. Orphanages gave way to what we would call at-risk youth. It still would have been children under the age of 18. They lived in a dormitory-style environment. They were what would be considered alternative kids now when they get sent to alternative school. That's probably what most people could equate to. We had that up until 2008, and then we had to sunset that because of cost limitations, and there hadn't been a meaningful youth program and outreach up until the time the new leadership came on in 2012. So that was one of the initiatives, was how do we bring the youth part of our mission back in a way that we can sustain it. We also had a wide range of services as it related to elder care. We had what's considered affordable housing that was in partnership with the HUD programming. We had what's considered in the industry market rate, which was assisted living or independent living, and we had also a community-based Medicaid assisted living program. So in my time, we created service lines, by creating the Ebby House, which became transitional housing for young women that is still operational today. The Youth Support Center, which we didn't have at the time, started in partnership with the Office of the Governor prior to the pandemic because we wanted to get more into sex trafficking, and now it continues today where we've expanded services to reach all at-risk youth outside of transitional housing. And then we also sunsetted some of our service lines. We had what was considered Type B assisted living, and no one wants an education and elder care regulatory environment, so I will not give you one. But it was, Type A was not traditionally, what you wanted. And so we moved into the Type B, which was expanding, but we were also sunsetting Medicaid, skilled nursing, and that was a service line that wasn't sustainable at the volumes that we had. And so it was this repurposing or reworking, all still under the banners of youth and children and elders, but in a way that became more sustainable. And I will say, this was not a short process. For those of us that are looking to, make changes, this is not a light switch. You don't decide these things and you just turn the light on or off and it's over. It requires a lot of meaningful, thoughtful work, angst, debate. When I think about the times I've gone to the board to ask them to change a service line, when many of them have been on our board for decades, have seen what we do and how it impacted someone's life, it's hard to give that up, right? And it can become very personal and hard to let go of because it's so hard to separate yourself from the story of what was to try to imagine what can be. So we've just been constantly in that change of that give and take, that tug, that tension that exists with any organization who's trying to stretch and be something still in the mission, but being different too. And it's going to always come back to sustainability for me.
Yeah. When we think about a mission of an organization, that's kind of what you're rooted in. And then the vision of an organization is forward thinking. And I think that has shifted a lot over the years while the mission remains the same and it's based in that need. But why do you think some organizations and specifically leaders are so resistant to shifting the vision? We're not touching the mission, but why do you think they're so resistant to that?
In my experience, I've thought a lot about this, especially recently, because if I look at my 15 years at Fowler, we've gone through multiple iterations, and we're in the third phase of that new iteration, right? So I have a lot of time to look back on what the first two were like, and now thinking about what's happened. And my experience is that people are resistant to change and adapting because they fear the unknown. Maybe they can't imagine what it's going to be like. Or it's, as I said a minute ago, they're so attached to the story of what was that any departure from that seems like a failure, seems like an abandonment of the mission. And I think for me, it's been important you don't overcome resistance, you over-communicate resistance. And what I mean by that is that you're not going to make people less resistant. They're not going to wake up and hear one little soundbite about change and be like, let's change it all. I'm down for it all. You will not. You have to over-communicate and get them comfortable through the repetitiveness of it. Right? If you've ever thought about the people you pass in the hallway that you say hello to that you literally know nothing about, you don't know where they live, you don't know anything about their marriage, but you have a comfort and almost an extension of trust simply because you see them in the hallway coming up in the elevator and they work in the office suite next to you, right? Or the building next to you, right? But if you think about it, what else are you basing that trust on or that belief on? Nothing but familiarity. So when I say you have to over-communicate resistance, you have to tell people why we're doing it. Why we're doing it. Why we're doing it. How they fit in it. You got to face the challenges of it's going to be hard too. And this has been a hard leadership lesson for me, especially in this last year. Not everybody comes along despite that. Because some people are so resistant and fearful of change, and you don't have time to work all of that out for them because it's embedded maybe in other things that are adjacent to this change but not really related to this change. And so you have to accept that there are going to be casualties in a growth process. It is not without its casualties of time, effort, people, resources. But my experience is the majority of people, if you can over-communicate resistance and say, we can do this, and this is why we can do it, and this is why it matters, and this is how it's going to look when we get there, and you're going to be a part of it, it can be extremely bonding. And I've formed some of the, greatest teams, or been part of the greatest teams who have lived through those hardships, right? Because, again, in my experience over my career, you're talking about less than 5% when I talk about it in terms of casualties. So you could say one casualty is one too many. And in some audiences or some belief systems, that would be true. But for the greater good of an organization that served for 135 years that we're trying to set up for another 135, I'll take those numbers. That's my CFO talking.
Yeah.
I try to reform her, but she does show up
She's
occasionally.
Still there. It's okay. We love her just as much. When you said something earlier, and we've talked about this a lot, that the fact that 501c3 or nonprofit is a tax status, not necessarily a business model. And when you look at how can we change, how can we grow, I know how you feel about the phrase, well, that's how we've always done it. And we could talk about that for probably 2 hours, but talk to me about what you would tell another leader who was wrestling with that tension, their board saying, well, this is what we've always done, or their team is saying, this is what we've always done, or maybe even they're feeling it, but they know that they need to adapt.
So many times I try to bring levity to a situation, especially if it's a serious situation.
Nicole?
So this will not
Levity.
surprise you. This is an actual true story that I have told to someone who said, well, that's the way we've always done it. And I'm like, cool. I'm going to keep paying you what we always paid you.
That's good.
In fact, I'm going to go all the way back to when this actual process started, and we're going to calibrate back to that pay, because if we always do it that way, we should just always do it that way. Then we wouldn't have a bottom line problem, because we'd just be always paying what everybody got hired in at. And then it's a moment where people sit back and they're like, wait just a minute. No, she did not. Because what I've done is give them an insight into what entrenched looks like, right? And they thought it was me as the leader or the organization. We were the villain in the story, right? Because everybody's got a hero or a villain story. But we're changing, and we want you to do something different, and we're the bad person, we're the villain for it. And what I do in that moment is to get them to realize, I absolutely not am going to get paid what you paid me before, because I've gotten education, I've gotten experience. Inflation has happened. Do you know what it costs to get milk? I've had a child. And I let them tick off all the things, and then I'm like, I would be horrified if I was you too. And this organization is just like that. It's just like that. We wake up and meet the day where it is, not how we imagine it to be, because if I imagined it, it would look like a freaking Disney movie set. Like birds would be landing on my shoulder. We would all be singing. Everyone would be perfectly coiffed. I mean, my hair would never look out of place. I certainly wouldn't have all this situation going on with gravity. It would be like Disney princess level. But I have to meet it where it's at. Right? And then ask myself, what am I going to do to engage with it? How does it inform the choice that I'm going to make? And so that's really what I do, is I try to shake them. Think of it like a virtual, I hate to say the word slap, but it's like that virtual shake of, hey, let me get you out of this mindset that you are really firmly committed to get you to understand or open the door just a little bit so that you can understand the why. Because going back to that over-communicate, you can't just keep pouring on a message to a closed door. Right? You got to know when to walk away from the door, right? Or adapt your message to get the door open to then bring in the other message that you wanted to, right? So I think that's important. So, I mean, that's literally the story I have told and what I use. Because, if you think about it, a lot of times our fear drives irrational thoughts.
Yes.
But we're not often having that conversation. And I can't say, Lacey, that is irrational. Stop thinking that.
Right.
I have to figure out a way to convey that in a way that invites Lacey into that discovery all on her own.
Yes.
Right? Because then she's going to be like, okay, I get it. Now the door's open. Now let's have this other conversation. Now let's talk about what's really real. What are you scared of? And oftentimes that one question about change and adaptation is what are you scared of? Well, I'm scared I'm not going to have a job. I'm scared I'm not going to be good enough. I'm scared I'm not going to know what to do. Okay, well, let's talk about that because I can give you reasons why none of that is true.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I think so much transformation and change and adapting has to go alongside vulnerability and being open to that and being transparent about it. And you do this so well of just saying, hey, we can't always do this. And that's okay. And we can sit in it and we can talk about it. But here's what's changing with not only in all of the changes of how you've worked with children and young women and the elderly community in the DFW area, laws have changed around that. Things have changed. The way we care for adults has changed and for the better, I think. So when I think about your team and your board, how do you communicate that of, hey guys, we're going to have a change and here's how we're going to do this? Because I know you lead with the levity and you make every meeting so joyful and just any interaction. But when you're going into that, how would you recommend a leader lead into their team of, hey guys, something else is happening? Because I think of the last 8 years that we've known each other when we've had things happen in the world that are completely out of our control. I mean, everyone has. Tell me how you do that with your team so that they feel vulnerable enough to say, Nicole, I'm scared. Or Nicole, I don't know if I can do this. And to your point, not everyone's going to come along. And that's okay, but how do you communicate that to your team?
You hit on it a little while ago when you said, lead with transparency. I really try to do that in all cases. The best way I know how to do that is show up as my authentic self. I mean, for me, I am who I am. I like to have a good time. I like to laugh. Leading with levity, that works for me. Right. I would say for any leader, lead with your authentic self and have an outline. Because a lot of times when we get uncomfortable with a situation or we're anticipating someone's not going to take the message that we're about to give it with open arms, or maybe they're going to have some reactions to it, have an outline that keeps you, think of it as like your compass, your true north, right? Because your own nerves can kind of override that, and you want to make sure that you are communicating for clarity. There's a difference between communicating for clarity and comfort. When I communicate for comfort, I'm trying to make myself comfortable. So I'm going to tell you why it's bad, and it's not that bad, but we're going to talk about it. I'm going to talk all the way around it, and you're like, what are we even talking about anymore?
Right. This goes back to the clear as kind. I know we've talked about this before, is you have to do that. That's an act of generosity as a leader, is to be very clear.
Yeah. And I think breaking it down to that you're communicating for clarity, especially on messages that you expect to have disruption or reaction to. So when I'm going into a board or a leadership team meeting, it's like somebody that works for me will sometimes say, do not bury the plot. What they're basically saying, do not leave the bad news to drop on me. And so I always kind of remember that, and I try to lead with, okay, here's what's happening, here's what we're going to discuss, and then you're going to give space to have the discussion. But I think there's another critical component that I would say is important. If you're not doing the work beforehand to foster trust, to foster people knowing that they can ask a question. Like I say, there are no stupid questions, because I absolutely believe that. Because if that hadn't been my belief system, I wouldn't know any of the stuff that I know that helps me do what I do. But I have to lay all that track work. It's like I remember during the pandemic, I would say to people all the time, God was preparing us for this, and we didn't even know it. We didn't even know it. But now we've got the skill, because of all this work that we did, to do what we have to do in this very critical time, uncertain time. And so I think it's about preparing your environment. How much do you allow people to have a difference of opinion? How much do you encourage them to bring information forward? How many times do you ask for questions, right? At CEO chats, I'll say, tell me something good. And I'll also say, tell me what's an opportunity. There's a way to do it to where it doesn't turn into, something, negative. But that's your job as the leader to do it. And I think, too, always you have to remember this. They're cueing off how you feel about that change. Like if I come in and I'm apprehensive, then they're going to take on some of that energy. So I've got to be real clear about the change, how I'm positioning it, that it's aligned with the mission, and that it is the next best step for us to take. Not that it's the next best decision, but it's the next best step. And I've spent a lot of time saying that, especially at the board level. I don't know that this is the absolute right decision, but based on what I know today, this is my next best recommendation. And what I say at Fowler is we pivot just like nobody's business. I feel like it is a hallmark. Like we probably should have it as a organizational characteristic. I'll have to think about that.
Core value?
Yeah,
Core
pivot?
value.
Yeah.
But we pivot because, again, we're going to meet the day where it is, right? And we're going to adapt. And I think when you tell people that, they can feel a certain kind of groundedness or comfort. Like, okay, this isn't what we wanted to hear. We're kind of uncertain, but she seems good with it, so we trust her. We're going to be good with it. And if we're not, she's going to give us some reasons why we should get good with it. And then everything kind of settles. So you have to think about what energy you're bringing in. And that goes to that planning. Planning your environment beforehand, planning an outline, centering yourself, and feeling really grounded in the message that you have to deliver. So
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
We're going to start to wrap this piece of the conversation, but good news, we're going to have a part 2 because
how could we not?
how could we not? And there's
dun.
other
The
fun
sequel.
topics that we want to talk about. Yeah, sequel. You're our first sequel guest. But before we do that, I do want to lean into this topic of generosity because it is an underlying theme of our podcast. Obviously, in our work, philanthropy is our focus. But a lot of what you have described today in the leader space, I see as a generosity of time and a generosity of patience. So I really want our guests and our listeners to hear the definition of generosity is way more than just financial resource, especially in the leadership seat. And as I'm listening to you talk and thinking about all the things that you've walked through the last several years, I think it must take an immense amount of time and patience and understanding to bring team members along in a way that maybe they're resistant and you're trying to over-communicate, which means repetition, a lot of extra time, thoughtfulness, and listening time. And when you're busy, your calendar's full, sometimes that can be a struggle. So any thoughts on just what is required of you as a leader in order to make change manageable in an organization and the generosity that requires?
I mean, it does. I like how you framed generosity of time. I think the extension of that is, and you hear this a lot in faith circles, you need to meet people where they are, right? And that can be frustrating if you're at a different place in the journey because you want to drag them to where you are. And you can't do that because they have to have their own lessons. And I do think that it requires a certain level of generosity to accept them and meet them where they are. Because a lot of times we want to judge and say, well, you shouldn't be there because you're grown, right? You should be here. But not everybody's had that same experience. And so for me, that generosity of time has been about me evolving my capacity and patience to say they're right where they're supposed to be and they're doing the best that they can. These are little hacks that I use to get my own mindset calibrated, right? So that I recognize nothing went wrong and I'm not seeking safety, but they're right where they need to be. Nothing's gone wrong. They're doing the best they can. And then how can I go meet them there? And then how can I strategically fit that into all of the different journeys that everyone on the team is on, everyone on the board is on, even constituents like donors, right? And that's a hard task for a not-for-profit leader. This is where, I think that when I started in the space 26 years ago, people served and worked in this environment because they were just the altruistic people of the earth. They wanted to do good, and we just know we're going to give a lot of time and we're going to do it for little money and we're going to serve on boards for 20 and 30 years because that's just what you do.
Yes.
And now it's not that people aren't generous and want to serve on boards and do all those things, but the pace of life has changed. The way people, look at service has changed. They might want to do it in more bite-sized pieces, right? And that generosity is adapted to a new being or beast, if you will. I'm not sure that we as not-for-profits have caught up for that to make that all completely integrated, because I think that generosity of time is so critical to mission-based organizations, right? I mean, philanthropic dollars is a key factor, and we all need them. But when I think about the future of Fowler and needing board members that are going to partner with me in strategic visioning work and the skill sets that are needed to imagine what Fowler is going to be for the legacy of Fowler long after we're gone, that takes a lot of time and generosity too, because these are volunteer folks.
Right.
And I think people coming into the business, although we are paying more competitively, I don't see the distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit. You still have to appeal to that person's altruistic side, because we're going to ask more, and the breadth of work, the span of control, the diversity of thought, it's going to be like out here as opposed to what they might get paid, in the for-profit model. So I think all of those things fall under generosity. I'm not sure if that I got to the answer of your question,
Yes.
Jennifer. So redirect me, because I feel like I might have rambled outside the fence line.
You're actually segueing us into part 2, which is perfect. So I think we'll call this a wrap on this episode and encourage people to embrace change, right? And leaders to bring their teams along with kindness but clarity when change is in the best interest of the mission. So thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Tune in for part 2 with Nicole, where we'll talk more about boards and volunteer service and more change in that space. Thanks for listening to the Mission Advancement Podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll be notified of future episodes. You can also find out more info at missionadvancement.com or on social channels. Thanks again for listening.